Richard Goodall, the winner of America's Got Talent, is finally back here in Indiana tonight.
That's right. He started his day going back to work at the school where he first earned his...
There are stories that feel manufactured for television, and then there are stories like Richard Goodall's, which feel almost too honest to belong there at all. He wasn't chasing a spotlight. He wasn't auditioning for fame. For more than 2 decades, Richard spent his working life pushing a mop down the hallways of West Vigo Middle School in Terre Haute, Indiana, doing a job that most people walk past without a second glance. And yet, somewhere between the classrooms and the cafeteria, something extraordinary was quietly taking shape. Richard sang while he worked, not for an audience, not for applause, just because the music lived in him and had to come out somewhere. Students grew used to hearing his voice drifting through the halls, and over time, the singing janitor became less a nickname and more an identity that the whole school shared with pride. What almost nobody knew, including many of the people closest to him, was that Richard had spent his entire life without knowing where that voice, or he himself, truly came from. He had been adopted as an infant, and for decades the story of his biological family remained a closed door he didn't even try to open. That quiet, private absence would eventually resurface in the most unexpected way. But at the time, it was just one more thing tucked beneath the surface of a man who mostly kept himself and let his singing do the talking. Terre Haute isn't the kind of place that usually produces overnight sensations. It's a mid-sized city in western Indiana, the kind of community where people know their neighbors and where a school custodian is more likely to be remembered for fixing a jammed locker than for having a once-in-a-generation set of pipes. That's exactly what made Richard's story land so hard when it finally reached a wider audience. He wasn't a trained vocalist who had been passed over by the industry. He wasn't someone chasing a second act after a failed first attempt at stardom. He was simply a man who loved to sing, who had never really stopped to consider whether the rest of the world might want to hear it too. In 2022, a video of Richard performing Journey's Don't Stop Believin' during a school event found its way onto the internet, and it did what few hallway performances ever do. It spread. People who had never set foot in Terre Haute were suddenly watching a middle-aged janitor deliver a rock anthem with a voice that seemed to belong on a bigger stage. Comment sections filled with disbelief, the same reaction playing out over and over as new viewers stumbled onto the clip for the first time. The footage was unpolished, filmed on someone's phone in an ordinary school hallway with fluorescent lighting and lockers in the background, and that rawness only made it hit harder. There was no stage production, no backing band, no lighting rig designed to build anticipation. Just Richard, a crowd of students, and a song most of them probably associated with their parents' generation. The clip kept circulating long after most viral moments fade, refusing to disappear the way so many internet trends do within a week or two. Instead, it kept finding new pockets of viewers months after it was first posted, eventually reaching the people who look for exactly this kind of story, the producers of America's Got Talent. For a show that thrives on surprise in the audience, Richard was close to perfect discovery, someone whose talent had been hiding in plain sight for years, waiting for the right moment and the right platform to finally be seen by more than just the students and staff who walked those halls every day. Getting the invitation to audition was one thing. Actually getting there was another. Richard had never been on an airplane in his life. In the spring of 2024, at 55 years old, he boarded his first flight and headed to Los Angeles to stand in front of judges who had seen thousands of hopefuls come and go. For most contestants, that alone would be a story worth telling. A man in his mid-50s leaving Indiana for the first time by air, trading a familiar routine of hallways and cleaning carts for airport terminals in a city he had never seen. When he opened his mouth and sang, "Don't Stop Believin'," something shifted in the room. The judges didn't just like it. They were visibly moved, and Heidi Klum hit her golden buzzer, sending Richard straight into the live shows and skipping the usual gauntlet most contestants have to survive week after week. The clip of that audition didn't just go viral. It exploded, racking up tens of millions of views and turning a school janitor into a recognizable face across the country almost overnight. Suddenly, people who had never heard of Terre Haute, Indiana, were searching his name, sharing his performance, and waiting for his next appearance the way they might follow a favorite artist's new release. Richard carried that momentum through the competition, choosing songs that meant something personal to him rather than simply chasing the biggest applause. He sang Michael Bolton's How Am I Supposed to Live Without You as a tribute to his relationship with his partner, Angie Van Noven, turning a competition round into something closer to a love letter performed in front of millions. Later, in the semifinals, he brought raw intensity to Survivor's Eye of the Tiger, proving he could do more than deliver one kind of performance and that his range extended well beyond the ballad that had made him famous in the first place. By the time the finale arrived, Richard had already become one of the season's most talked about competitors, someone fans actively rallied around online in a way that went beyond simple admiration for a good voice. The show gave him a moment that felt tailor-made for his story. He returned to Don't Stop Believin', the song that had started it all, but this time he wasn't alone. Neil, Sean, and other members of Journey joined him on stage, turning his signature performance into a full-circle moment few contestants ever get to experience, let alone with the very band whose music had carried them there. In September 2024, Richard Goodall was crowned the winner of America's Got Talent Season 19, taking home the show's $1 million prize and becoming the first singer to win the competition in 5 years. Just days before that finale aired, he and Angie had quietly gotten married, blending one of the biggest nights of his professional life with one of the most important days of his personal one, a detail that made his eventual victory feel even more layered once fans learned about it afterward. Winning a talent competition tends to invite a certain assumption that the person walks off stage and straight into a completely different life, complete with relocation to Los Angeles or Nashville, a management team, and a calendar suddenly overflowing with red carpets. For Richard, that wasn't quite how it went, and that's part of what makes what happened next so interesting. Instead of packing up and chasing the entertainment industry full-time, Richard went back to Terre Haute and back to work. He returned to his job at West Vigo Middle School, mop and all, doing the same work he'd done for more than 2 decades before anyone outside Indiana knew his name. For roughly 2 years after his win, Richard kept showing up to that job, clocking in on ordinary weekday mornings just like he always had. He spoke about it directly in interviews, describing how he planned to keep working at the school for as long as it made sense, while music opportunities built up quietly in the background rather than arriving all at once. He wasn't shy about sharing the ordinary side of his post-fame life either. He posted photos of himself cleaning the school cafeteria and waxing the floors, the same tasks that had defined his working life long, before a viral video changed everything, and fans seemed to appreciate the honesty of it just as much as they'd appreciated his singing. There was something almost reassuring about seeing a national television winner, still doing the unglamorous work that most people never think twice about. When asked how his newfound fame was landing with the students who saw him every single day, Richard was refreshingly candid. The kids who watched him win on national television were still the same kids who walked past him in the hallway each morning, and the novelty of his fame naturally faded into the rhythm of ordinary school days. For them, he wasn't a celebrity so much as a familiar adult in the building who happened to have also done something remarkable on television, a distinction that mattered a great deal to Richard, who never seemed interested in being treated differently by the people who had known him longest. That's not to say his life stood still. Richard kept performing, largely close to home, taking on local shows around Indiana, while also making trips to Nashville to work on original music, slowly building the foundation of a music career, rather than rushing into one. He returned to the America's Got Talent stage in 2025 for the show's 20th anniversary special, delivering Eye of the Tiger once again. This time as part of a larger celebration alongside other alumni from the show's history. It was a moment that let him look back at how far he'd come, from a nervous first-time flyer auditioning in front of strangers to a returning champion sharing the stage with performers from across the show's 20 seasons, a night that had far less riding on it than his original audition, but carried just as much emotional weight for the people who had followed his journey from the beginning. There's a certain irony in a man becoming a household name for singing about not stopping believing, only to spend the next 2 years proving that the most powerful part of his story wasn't the belief itself, but the follow-through. Plenty of viral moments fizzle because the person behind them either can't sustain the attention or changes so much under pressure fame that the thing people originally connected with disappears. Richard avoided that trap almost entirely, largely by refusing to treat his old life as something to be discarded the moment a new one became available. Fans who kept up with his social media updates got a strange but comforting kind of split-screen experience. national television appearances and viral moments on one side, cafeteria cleaning photos and school hallway routines on the other, both belonging to the same unassuming man. Of everything that happened to Richard after his win, one story stands apart from the music and the headlines because it has nothing to do with performing at all. Richard had grown up adopted, without any real information about his biological parents, and for most of his life, that chapter simply stayed closed. It wasn't something he spoke about publicly, and for a long time it seemed like it might remain a private, unresolved piece of his history, something millions of AGT fans would never even know existed. With encouragement from his wife Angie and the help of an Ancestry DNA service, Richard finally went looking for answers, a decision that carried far more uncertainty than any performance he'd ever given. There was no guarantee the search would lead anywhere, and no way to know what kind of reception, if any, he might find on the other end. In the summer of 2025, he shared the results with his followers, introducing the world to a man named Hubert, a retired K-9 police officer and Army veteran living in Indianapolis. Hubert had never known Richard existed. Decades had passed with no contact, no knowledge, nothing connecting them except blood, and suddenly a father who thought he had no children found out he had a grown son, one who happened to have just won America's Got Talent. Richard didn't share every detail of that first meeting, but the emotion in his message was impossible to miss, and he made a point of crediting Angie for pushing him to finally take that leap, describing the discovery as something he might never have pursued without her support. He also mentioned learning that Hubert shared his own love of music, having played instruments like drums, guitar, and mandolin over the years, an unexpected thread connecting father and son who had lived entirely separate lives until that point. Alongside discovering his father, Richard also learned that he had siblings he had never known about, adding an entirely new branch to a family tree he had spent his whole life without any real information on. It's the kind of story that could easily have overshadowed everything else about his post-AGT life, and in many ways it revealed something important about Richard himself. For all the attention his voice had brought him, this quieter, deeply personal reunion mattered just as much, if not more. It gave him something fame alone never could, a sense of where he came from, delivered at exactly the point in his life when he finally had the platform and the courage to go looking for it. By 2026, the balancing act Richard had maintained for 2 years, keeping his day job while building a music career on the side, finally reached its natural end. He announced that he was retiring from his position at West Vigo Middle School, closing out his tenure at the conclusion of the school year, rather than walking away abruptly the moment fame arrived. When asked about the timing, Richard explained it simply. Finishing out that particular school year just felt like the right moment, rather than trying to draw a hard line at some earlier point when the win was still fresh. It wasn't a dramatic exit or a sudden decision made in the heat of his AGT victory. It was a slow, considered transition that matched the way Richard had approached almost everything since his audition, carefully, without rushing toward the next big thing just because he suddenly could. For 2 full years, Richard had effectively lived 2 lives at once, showing up for a job he'd held since before most of his fans were paying attention to him, while quietly laying the groundwork for a music career on evenings, weekends, and an occasional trip out of state. That kind of patience is unusual for someone in his position. Plenty of reality competition winners try to capitalize on their moment immediately, understandably worried that public attention won't last. Richard took the opposite approach, treating his AGT when less like a finish line to sprint through and more like to start a much longer, steadier climb. Retirement from the janitorial job didn't mean Richard was stepping away from public life. If anything, it opened the door to the next phase his music career had been building toward all along, now with fewer constraints on his time and schedule. And then in June of 2026, came a piece of news that turned Richard's story into something even bigger than a singing competition victory: a movie deal. Richard signed on with production companies Everard Entertainment and Mad Chance to develop a feature film based on his life, with producers Ben Everard and Andrew Lazar leading the project. Everard described Richard's path from sweeping school hallways to standing at the center of one of television's biggest stages as capturing something essential about the idea of the American dream, adding that he'd been captivated from the very moment Richard first stepped onto that audition